Hi again, everybody. Here's a fun little game that was played in 1930 in Copenhagen with Norman Hansen with the white pieces and Anderson with the black, and it's a Petrov's defense. And it starts out e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and now white goes ahead and takes off the e-pawn. Black plays the pawn up to d6, and white puts the knight back on f3, and then black takes off white's e-pawn, and now white plays his d-pawn up to d4, and black plays his d-pawn up to d5. Now white develops his bishop out to d3, and black goes ahead and pins the knight at f3 with bishop to g4. Now white goes ahead and castles. Now black brings out his bishop to d6. And now white plays his c-pawn up to c4, hitting at the d-pawn, but instead of defending the pawn by, say, moving his pawn up to c6, black just goes ahead and castles. So white goes ahead and takes off the pawn at d5. And now, since the knight at e4 is not protected, black plays his f-pawn up to f5. Now white brings his knight out to c3, and now the knight at e4 is attacked twice and only defended once, but again black does not defend it. He simply brings out his other knight from b8 to d7. Now before white goes ahead and wins a pawn, he decides to hit at that bishop at g4, and he plays his pawn up to h3. And after black retreats the bishop back to h5, then white goes ahead and captures the knight at e4 with his own knight. And black recaptures with the f-pawn, and then white captures the pawn with his bishop. Now black moves his knight from d7 to f6, hitting at the bishop and forcing it to abandon the pawn at d5. But instead of retreating the bishop, white plays the bishop up to f5. Now obviously the pawn at d5 is unprotected and black could take it, but actually that would be a mistake, because if he did capture the pawn with the knight, then white would play bishop to e6 check with a double attack on the knight, and the only way to counter both threats is to play his own bishop back to f7. But then white would simply play the knight to g5. And now, no matter what black does, he will lose the exchange. In other words, obviously he can't capture the bishop at e6, because if he does, white would then just recapture with the knight, forking the queen and the rook. So instead of grabbing that pawn at d5, black just moves the king into the corner. And now white positions the bishop very strongly by moving it to e6. Now black plays his knight up to e4. And white decides to chase off that bishop by playing the g-pawn up to g4. And so black retreats the bishop back to g6. And now I think white anticipates that black is going to move his queen up to f6 and attack that knight at f3 for a second time, so he moves his king up to g2. And sure enough, black does bring the queen to f6. And now white goes ahead and develops his bishop out to e3. And black swings his rook over from a8 to e8. And now white decides to push his pawns on the king side, and he plays his h-pawn up to h4. I guess intending to move it up to h5 and make the bishop retreat even further. But now black kind of makes a surprising move. He sacrifices the exchange. He captures the bishop at e6 with his rook. and white of course recaptures with the d-pawn. Now, why did he do that? Well, that's probably the reason it's time for the challenge to the viewer. If you'd like to pause the video now and see if you can find black's next move, I'll wait for you. Black plays the surprising move, knight to c3, hitting at the queen and obviously trying to force it off of the diagonal, which is protecting the knight at f3. Now, white of course could just make the obvious capture with the b-pawn, but suppose white decided to counterattack. Suppose he played his bishop to g5, hitting at black's queen. Well, black would just go ahead and capture the queen at d1, and then white would capture the queen at f6, and then black would recapture with his rook, and white would recapture the knight with his rook, say on a1 there. But then black would play his trump card. He could play the bishop to e4, which literally pins and wins the knight at f3. So, in the end, after black plays the surprising move knight to c3, white does go ahead and play the obvious move. He captures the knight with the b-pawn. But now, black can take that bishop from g6 and play it to e4, which does pin and win the knight. And now white realizes that the knight's going to be captured on the next move, and his h-pawn, under attack by the queen, is unprotected, and so he moves his king to h3. But that turns out to be the final mistake, because now black has a very interesting mate in 6. And it starts out by the queen taking the knight at f3 with check. And the only way white can get out of check is to recapture with his own queen. And now begins a very interesting little dance by the rook. The rook takes the queen at f3 with check. And the only move white has is to move the king to g2. And now black plays rook to g3 with a double check. And the only move is king to h2 for white. And now black plays rook to g2 with a double check. Now, obviously, if white plays the king up to h3, then black plays rook to h2. Checkmate. So instead, white moves the king to h1. But then black simply plays rook to h2, double check again, and the only move left is king to g1 for white, and then black ends the game with rook to h1. Checkmate. A very interesting little maneuver by the rook there at the end. In other words, if you want to just focus in on the rook real fast, it goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the game, and I'll see you next time.